We are really glad to be the hosts of this Reformed Institute event today, and we welcome those who are online. Glad that you've joined us as well. I am pleased to introduce to you someone that I've met on the phone and online recently, and just today in person, Dr. Ellen Clark Clément. It's a book that she wrote, Discerning Welcome, which is highly relevant to us because we as a congregation have been dealing with some immigration issues and particular people who are seeking asylum. And so she has written this book on a Reformed faith approach to refugees. And it was just right up our alley. So we were very pleased to arrange for her to come here and do an adult class session on October 9th. And while we were at it, we said, well, can you come and do a Reformed Institute thing? And it didn't turn out to be the same day, but we're glad that she's willing to come twice. Dr. Ellen Clark Clément is an attorney, and she has done, sort of refugee work as an attorney. And she's also the senior pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Chatham Township in New Jersey. And so we're really pleased to have you here and welcome. So
good morning, everyone. Well, thank you very much for that kind welcome. So much of this morning talk is about welcoming, and so I'm grateful for that, and want to thank you, Neil, for welcoming me and hosting me here at Darnestown Presbyterian Church, and also to thank Larry Goleman, the director of the Reformed Institute here in the capital area, that I can be present with you this morning with the Reformed Institute. It's a great honor for me as a pastor and budding theologian, but also just to present my work that was done as a study starting about 5 years ago, and now has become all the more relevant as we address new issues in the area of refugee and immigrant access to the U.S. and to our own communities. So I want to be talking about that. Also thank the Presbyterian women of the National Capitals area, especially Sheila Weiss, who's been so helpful in communicating with me, the vice moderator there, and is talking with the different people online. So I'm glad you all could be a part of this morning as well. So I welcome the Presbyterian women. And also thanks to Ms. Yvonne Montgomery, who's been helping get this on Zoom and live cast this morning, again with the Reformed Institute. So thank you, Yvonne, and to all of you who are here both in person in Darnestown Presbyterian Church and also online this morning. I'm grateful to be here with you. So I'll be talking about my book, Discerning Welcome, but also recent events in the immigration situation that we find ourselves in. And I want to give you a general sense of what we'll be doing this morning. So we'll have about 2 hours together, and we'll start the first section looking at our individual relationship with the newcomer in our midst and our own personal transformation that may have taken place with some of you, or is in taking place, or maybe you've already come to a place where you are able to welcome and discern for yourself a way to welcome all strangers at your door, based at basic Christian understanding, and also trying to wrestle with our secular laws on the refugee and immigrant. And so this first hour, I'll be talking to you about my own story on why I wrote this book and how my own transformation came about. And then we'll look at some definitional important legal terms about what does it mean to be a refugee? There are certain legal protections that are offered by that status. And often in the news or in our own conversation, we gloss over the legal meaning, and we just refer to people as a refugee, or maybe we've been using terms like illegal alien for people that are not with a visa. And how does that affect our thinking and our welcome? And there are other categories as well. We'll talk about that. And then I want to offer to you the spectrum of ethical outcomes that one could easily discern and choose as a Christian approach. So there's no one right answer. So much depends on your context. where you live, who's in your neighborhood, how you could be helping and welcoming in ways that are not appropriate or you think could be done better elsewhere in other ways for the neighbor that you want to love. And so I want to say this morning that I'm not espousing a particular result so much as I'm trying to teach congregations and individuals about discerning how to make your own decision about welcoming your stranger, your neighbor, your person in need who comes to your door. So that'll be the basic outline of this morning's teaching. In the first hour, I'll also talk about some other approaches from the Roman Catholic tradition, the social teaching for the emphasis on the preference for the poor, the Reformed faith tradition we'll look into very deeply, and then also the laws around immigration. And then we'll break into small groups here. In the first section, we'll have 3 groups. Maybe we'll use these 3 areas here in the church. And then online, you'll have an opportunity to have breakout rooms, and that'll be set up for you. We have 3 questions. They're all very similar about welcome. And that'll be a chance for you to talk together about some ideas I'll have just shared with you, and you can test drive some discernment. Then after that, we'll regroup, we'll share some of what you discussed, and then have a coffee break for a few minutes so that we can get ready for the next section. Will be the second hour. And there I'll want to talk to you more about the community emphasis on the welcome, the way of discerning as a church. How will you want to approach the refugee in your town, at your church door, or in your own personal life? So that'll be a more of a look at John Calvin in Geneva, the refugee history in the Reformed tradition. We'll look at some work by Karl Barth, and we'll also consider some of the history and the examples from World War II. So that'll be part of the second hour. And I'll be sharing with you also ideas that are significant on the way we look theologically at individuals and their status as created in the image of God, and how can we connect with them better. So all of that will take place in the second hour, and then we'll close with another breakout group to look at one group question we'll do together. And then I'll take your comments, questions, we'll reflect on what we learned and discussed, and close with a Q&A at the end with a prayer. Let us pray. Welcoming God, we give you thanks for this day, for our church community, our Presbyterian tradition, and for your guidance in our lives. We ask that you would be with us now as we consider ways of discerning welcome for those in need, for those we may not have considered even as being in our neighborhoods. Help us to recognize their presence in our lives and in our communities, that we might welcome them in Christ's name. Amen. So beginning with the story of why I wrote this book, Discerning Welcome, and what happened to trigger my own sense of transformation around people that were in my community, and I didn't really understand their situations and wasn't sure that it affected me personally. But if you have read the article I shared in Christian Century, there was a time I was pastoring a church in Metuchen, New Jersey, a few years ago, when this event occurred that made me recognize that within my own congregation, we had a person that was an immigrant, a refugee, but had not kept his visa alive, was not really meant to continue in our community without having proper legal documentation. And none of us knew it. He had been worshiping with us for over 20 years and raised his family in the congregation. His daughters were baptized in the church. He was a deacon, and he was an active member in the congregation. And so when he was arrested one morning, we discovered that this friend of ours, Roby, was in fact without visa, and he was incarcerated, detained, but without a bond hearing, with no bail hearing, no judge met with him. He was not given any of our due process rights that would normally be given to any U.S. citizen. And I can say that there is a constitutional protection in the 14th Amendment that he should have been given as an alien those same rights, and was not. But he was held in a facility in Essex County, New Jersey for several months. And it was during that time that I experienced a sense of responsibility, and also a recognition that I had not been aware of the many people that live in my own community, in my own neighborhood, worshiping with me in my own church, that are not held and protected by our legal system, but in fact are kind of floating under the radar and trying to do the best they can to raise their families in a place of freedom and peace. So that was a time for me that it was extraordinarily transformational. And so I found that I was able to overcome a lot of what was holding me up as a Christian and as a lawyer. So for me, having practiced law for over 20 years before I went to seminary, before I really heard this call to preaching and pastoral care, to dedicating my life to the teachings of Christ, that I was very much dedicated to upholding the laws and respecting them. I had sworn an oath of office to do that. And so for me, I always wanted to be able to say, well, you're welcome here, but you need to have permission to be here if you're an immigrant. I would think that would be an easy thing to do. You fill out papers and you're okay. I didn't know how easy it is to slip out of the system, that you can arrive here in the US, you can be given a tourist visa, it's valid for a year, but not everyone who's receiving that visa realizes if they're seeking refuge, that they have to take more steps to be here longer term in order to have a refugee or asylee status. So it's easy for you to lose your rights to stay in the US, even if you initially had them. And that was the case with the man in my congregation who'd flown here from Indonesia and was given a visa, then had applied for asylum, but his application was faulty and he had an attorney that was not giving him good advice, and disappeared, and he thought everything was set, but it was not. His application had been rejected, and there was follow-up that he could have done that he did not know to do. So there was a lot of issues around language and not understanding, and a lot of things for me to learn as a Christian, as a member of the community. Even though I had been practicing law, I didn't know everything about what can face a recent immigrant. So these were aspects that I was learning about, and I wanted to share with you some of the details, but also to reflect today on some current issues, things that when I started writing this book, the theme was all about the illegal alien, this illegal person almost was the way people were being described who were trying to come across the border with Mexico. There was a lot of political, in terms of bipartisan, Democrat, Republican stress, and the conversation was much more negative than it is today. And I think an example of that, I just saw in the paper yesterday, you might have seen an article about a judge in Massachusetts that had been involved in a hearing with an immigrant in Massachusetts in 2016, maybe it was 2018. And this person who was an immigrant had been undocumented. There was a hearing, I'm not sure what the issue was about, but that person was given permission to leave after the hearing. But at a sidebar, the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorney got together, and the defense attorney said, well, you know that there's an ICE agent, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Police. He's out in the lobby of this courthouse. And when you release him, he's going to be arrested again and right back where he was this morning. It just doesn't seem appropriate. And then there was conversation that ongoing conversation amongst the attorneys was going to be held confidential. So we don't know what happened next, except that the judge invited the defendant who was being released or given time to stay at home, she invited him to exit out the back door because she knew that the agent was in the lobby. And when that happened, the person he exited out the back door and got away. And she was then either arrested or accused, or in any event, definitely interrupted and put into the news cycle of judge is obstructing justice, has aided and abetted an illegal alien to flee, and he got away. But today, when that same news came out, it says the United States has dropped charges against the judge accused of helping immigrant escape ICE. That was the headline I'm reading from an article in the Times from yesterday. And there was a sense that this was a case that should not have been brought, that this really was perhaps a error of judgment for the judge, or that there was some sense of maybe this could have been handled differently, but it wasn't a crime. It's probably didn't raise to the level of obstruction of justice, but the political climate has changed quite a bit, especially since the war with Ukraine. So it was interesting to read about, and if you're interested, I have a copy of that article, but I'm sensing today that we have a different understanding, a different view of who are these people that are coming to our shores? How are the different concerns being addressed? And are we able to help our neighbor? And is what she did as a judge so bad after all? And I think there's been a reviewing of those terms. So that's where we are. We're in a different place today than when I first wrote this book. And I think that is part of the conversation, but I want to share with you now some terms, because in writing the book, I wanted to avoid the bipartisan political issues and just focus on refugees and welcome. And that continues now. When I talk about politics this morning, or the political climate, I'm talking about the polis, which is the Greek term for the community we live in. The polis is where we get the word political from, but how we live in community is our polis. And so political theology will be the theology of our common life together. And so I'll be referring to that. And then under the US law, you should know that a refugee is one who has applied for a status of protection in our country, or the country that person is seeking to reside in, where they will have protections, be given the right to stay and to live in peace. And in order for, in the US situation, in order to come to the US, person applying to be a refugee has to do so from their home country. And then they have to be vetted. They have interrogation by CIA people, FBI, they're very detailed background checks to make sure that this person is not a terrorist, that this person is safe to come into our country and would live peacefully among us. And one of the key concepts of the whole political theology approach to this is that the refugee, the person seeking asylum, what they want is a way to live peacefully, to raise their family, to live, to work at a job, and not suffer from persecution, whatever it was they faced back at home. And in fact, that's the same thing that we want in our citizenship home area. We want to live peacefully. We don't want to be destabilized by having people come in who would create insurrection. So we do look at who's coming. We do have laws about keeping the ingress of immigrants to be limited to people who are not going to commit terrorist crimes. But we want the same thing, both the refugee and the citizen coming together. We want a peaceful polity. And so that is always going to be in the background as you discern, will we be able to continue our peaceful life together? And then as Christians, what we're looking for is to be able to have the peaceful ability to worship God. That's our ultimate goal, that we can freely worship. People coming in, they can freely worship, but we all will be able to live at peace together. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward in this project of discernment together. So other terms that will be helpful for you to think about is also to know an asylee, seeking asylum. You can do that when you arrive in the United States. It is not illegal for someone to cross the border from Mexico to the United States and to turn themselves in or to approach the border officials area and say, I am persecuted in my home country. I need asylum. They're standing in the US now, never had applied to be a refugee, but they apply at the border or at the airport or wherever there's a national boundary area for immigrants. And there they make their case that they have been persecuted. They're in fear of their lives. And that is the threshold question that has to be proven at the border to an immigration judge. So some of the people that come across recently who came over from Mexico, the group mainly from Venezuela, they traveled through Central America, they get to the Mexican border, they come in, we've been persecuted, we're in fear of our lives. They are often given permission to stay in the United States until they have a hearing with a judge about, is this a legitimate claim? Can this person be given asylee status in the United States? And we saw that group, especially of notoriety, that was flown to Martha's Vineyard looking for refuge. And then if you'd read through the article, there was great concern because some of them now risk being in Martha's Vineyard. Their hearing was back in Texas, and they might have missed that opportunity to speak to the judge about their desire, their wish for asylee status. And that would have been unfortunate. I don't know if any one of them were precluded if they were able to get back in time, but that was so critical that they get to have that hearing, because if they miss the hearing, then they do fall out of the system and they've been deemed to be here illegally after that. And so there we do have the concern of people that are living in the US and don't have permission to do so. But are there times when we will say, that's okay, we can absorb them as Christians? We're going to welcome those people and find ways to normalize their situation, to legalize their status. And that may be a place where you come out as Christians in your own community and say, that's what we want to do to help. And there are a lot of interesting ways to do that. And just as a note, I'm interested in the Presbyterian Women's Group talking later with their guests. I think there was one group coming called Just Neighbors. Is that right? It sounded so interesting to have attorneys helping recent immigrants to regularize their status here, to find a way to get them the visas they need to put their files in order. So I'd be interested in hearing more about their work. So I wanted to share with you that. Also, another issue that came up recently on Afghan evacuees. So one more term for you is special immigrant visa that was given to the Afghanis who had helped the US troops after the Afghan withdrawal of US troops. I guess it was last year now, that there was several Afghanis who had, thousands of them who had helped our troops, who had worked as translators and drivers and just were assisting our people in Afghanistan. And they were promised protection, or they were led to believe they would have it, be able to come into the United States. And when the evacuation happened, many of them were not able to have completed their process of becoming refugees. So again, as a refugee, you'd have to apply, go through this background check. So there's this intermediate stage called the special immigrant visa that was given to people that were on track to be deemed refugees, but they hadn't completed all the paperwork, and there was a sense that these folks should be allowed in. Those who were here, there are some also from the Ukraine who were given SIV visas. Those visas are only valid for 18 months. So 18 months from their entry, they're going to have the same issue as those who flew in on a tourist visa that lasted 1 year. They're going to need to take action in the in-between months in order to be sure that they can stay longer. And so that's another area where you might find in your neighborhood somebody with an SIV visa who becomes part of the community and is with you in different areas of your life, and all of a sudden they no longer have the status to stay. And how can we be welcoming? And what are ways that your community could address that, or at least know that the risk is there How do you educate, inform, assist these people who are seeking peace and a welcome to our country? So those are some background areas and interesting articles that have just been in the news lately, and I wanted to share with you. And you may have other questions later we can raise about what you've been seeing, what experiencing in your life now. But I wanted to go back and look now at the different ways of welcoming to think about, and then to remind you that it's your decision to make based on your context and your comfort level with people's status, their legal status, and understanding how slippery that can be around the edges of when things need to be filed, and are the people with papers that are up to date. It's not always an easy thing. So also being aware of worship as a way of welcoming for those who are Christian. It's not all of the refugees coming in are Christian, but how can we be welcoming to them if they are, Muslim? Is there a mosque in the area? You can share people, direct them to where they might find comfort, or just to know, where is there an immigration resource center in your community? Is that something that you could help create? So different areas of thinking about, advocating for legislative change, working on our immigration system that's so complicated. The laws are confusing, and it's not any one administration that has put all of these confusions into place. It's been an accretion of laws over, well, hundreds of years, but certainly over decades, and they don't all line up well. And there are political movements, but also social pressures on legislators that have influenced the way our immigration system has been developed, and it is overrun now with so many people seeking to enter the country. But again, for the purpose of this book, I'm limiting us just to look at the refugee, the people that I'm going to say more broadly are refugees, both asylees and the people that have applied for refuge status, and those who've fallen out of that category if they haven't kept their papers in line and they've done their best. So we'll look at that together. But a second concept I want to introduce to you now is this idea of the importance of your political identity. And to be born into a nation means that you're being born into a political identity from birth. So wherever you are, you would have that right to a passport, to citizenship in your own country. And that's so important, the way we've organized our world, this geopolitical multiple nation states. So we have that once you're identified by your nation, you have certain protections as a citizen, some countries more than others. But once you either reject your country's government because they've been persecuting you and you want to flee, or that country has rejected you, as they've done in cases of genocide, situations certainly in World War II, where the Jews were completely stripped of their German citizenship, and they were described as stateless on identity papers. Those people have no political rights left. When it's time to ask for help or protection, no one's listening. And so it's so significant to understand the importance of having a political identity as people travel, as they seek out protection, and the importance of a U.S. Citizenship status can be extremely valuable for people around the world. So a couple examples I wanted to give you. One is a story from a friend of mine who I grew up with, and she is a Jewish person. Her parents are Jewish, and her mother is a Holocaust survivor. And when we were 10 years old, I didn't know too much about the Holocaust other than just a little bit of what you'd learn at age 10. But I do remember my friend Heidi telling me how her mother had this doll, and her father had given it to her when she was a young child. I didn't know then that at the time they were in an internment camp in the Netherlands, that her grandparents, my friend's grandparents, were German Jews. They had been fleeing from Germany. They thought if they got to the Netherlands, they'd be free from the Nazi threat. In order to leave Germany, though, you had to pay the government extraordinary fine or fee or most of your wealth to get out at a certain point in the late 1930s. They got to the Netherlands poorer than they started, but they had some money left. And the grandfather, so the father of my friend's mother, took an extraordinary amount of their cash and he put it inside the doll. And he gave it to his daughter, who at the time was about 10 years old, and said, don't ever let this doll out of your sight. And if a guard tries to take it, cry and moan and whine your very worst tantrum, so they'll give it back to you. And she always did that. And she held that doll through the course of the war. And I'll tell you more details about it, but that money was used to get them back to safety at the end of the war. That family survived, but not just because of a doll with money in it. It was because her father, so the grandfather of my friend, was able to take another portion of their wealth and pay off a person who was in the black market for fake passports that were coming out of Switzerland through the Uruguayan embassy. And with this diplomatic kind of black market channel, he was able, the Jewish grandfather was able to give money to his colleague who was Christian at their workplace, what they shared now in the Netherlands. He said, we know that we're being called up to report to the Nazi troops here. If we don't go, we know we'll be shot. So take this money, do whatever you can to help us. So the Christian friend took the cash and learned of this passport scheme and was able to acquire this Uruguay passport that was not good for travel, but it was good for identification. And he was able to get the 4 photographs of the family members, either, I don't know how that was organized, but he got the 2 adults and the children onto this passport and returned to them. And he was able to get it to the grandfather before they were gone into this internment camp. And later, during the time the family was in a Dutch internment camp, every man on the camp, almost 500 of them, were being sent to Dachau in the morning. And so my friend's grandfather was there on the line, and he said goodbye to his family that morning. They were all in barracks, and it was a final goodbye. Sincerely, he thought he was never going to see his family again. And he stood in line with the other men and he was discouraged. And one of them said, but I thought you had that passport. He said, well, I've showed it before and it's not gotten me anywhere. Here I am with you. And he said, well, try it. You need to do something. So he pulled out this paper and he showed it to the Nazi guard. And he said, I'm Uruguayan, I can't go. And the Nazi guard looked at paperwork. It showed an identity. It showed a political identity that this man was from Uruguay. And he pulled him out of the line and he said, get lost, go back to the barracks. I don't want to see you here again. And the whole train left, and the inventory of human beings on it was meant to have 500. They had 499. And my friend's mother, this little piece of paper was given to him that said something like dismissed or something. They carried that in their personal papers every day of their lives after, because that was what saved him. But what really saved him was this political identity that had been robbed of the family when they were in Germany because they were Jews and their German paperwork said stateless. So that they used that identification card again and again to get back to the Netherlands after the war. So they were able to live out their time in a work camp, which it was amazing they survived that, frankly, because of the starvation and the bad hygiene. But they were able to get back. And again, having a political identity helped them get back to the Netherlands after the war, because even then, the Dutch, even after the war, they weren't so sure they wanted Jews back. There was still anti-Semitism. There were still issues. But what if you had that political identity, you were a step ahead of everybody else who was stateless. And so that's why it's something to remember. It's important to have a political link And so we don't want to necessarily divorce ourselves, church and state, but know that we're working together. And that is a Reformed concept that we'll see later as I speak about John Calvin and the work he did, that we're keeping that link alive. Another piece in this linking up of church, state, and human to state is the idea of a humanitarian link with a political link. And one of the problems that was identified after the war that I wasn't aware of until I researched this book was that the Red Cross going in during World War II to Europe to try to understand what was happening and what aid could be given in a politically neutral way that they wanted to preserve, learned of the concentration camps, that the Jews were being sent in essentially a genocide situation. They were being expelled and destroyed in these camps. But the Red Cross determined that that was a political issue, so they didn't report it. They wanted to offer humanitarian aid, and they did, but they didn't want to raise their voice about something they deemed to be political. And so some have argued that that was, in fact, being complicit with the Nazi machine by not speaking up. And what if they had spoken up? And maybe that would have changed the course of history, or certainly changed minds, and the politics of bringing the US into that war took us time to get to that place of being ready to join in. So the humanitarian political link and the human national identity, political identity link, these are two pieces of who we are as people and as who we are as communities living together that are important, that we not detach them. As much as we say, we don't want to hear politics from the pulpit, I think we don't want to hear bipartisan politics, but being part of a polis, we need to be responsible in our community. And sometimes it's the church that has to be the one that is the moral exemplar for the world. And that's a big responsibility, but one that we can aspire to. It takes courage. And also, I think it takes discernment. Where are we? What is our context? What do we understand of the world? And sometimes we don't have all the information to make those good decisions. So some of what I'm telling you about World War II, that we just didn't know. People at the time maybe didn't have all that information. So it's an interesting situation looking at history and our own Reformed faith approach, what guides us, and what I wanted to just summarize quickly. As Reformed Christians in the Reformed tradition, Presbyterian, Reformed Church of America, others in that line, will be looking always at scriptural authority to guide us on our way. And I'm glad to see many churches, and the theme for the Presbyterian women's group this morning being Matthew 25, particularly verses 34 and 35, that I was hungry and you fed me, I was thirsty, you gave me drink, I was naked, you gave me clothing to wear, and I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And this is what so incentivizes so many of us in our mission work. It makes it really clear what our goal is and what we should be doing in our lives together as Christians, is to welcome the stranger. And what does that look like? And also we see in Leviticus the command where we see this brought into the great command by Jesus later, but in Leviticus it starts out, you shall love the alien as yourself, for you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. So this precept, starting from the very earliest days in the Hebrew Bible, that we include in our own, and this idea of receiving the alien. We still use this term, the alien, in our U.S. Constitution. The resident alien is the person who is not a citizen but lives among us in residence. So these are our scriptural authority for why we look to welcome. And then we also have the covenant with God, God's covenant with Adam, and then renewed in God's covenant through Christ to be with us, to be walking with us, to be ever loving, merciful, and present in our lives. And we too responding to God with this return of faithfulness and loving kindness to others. And through this covenant idea, we also continue to look to understanding the stranger and then as our neighbor, as also being created in the image of God, and that we would want to welcome the stranger based on this covenant idea as well, another reformed concept. And then later, after our break, I want to talk to you about John Calvin's life as a refugee and how that influenced his thinking and his entire adulthood, having to flee for his life in leaving France, coming into Geneva, where he spent most of his life as a pastor, theologian, and community organizer. That Genevan community was reforming politically as well as theologically. So those are important elements for us to consider together, how our faith tradition has been informed by someone who himself was a refugee and welcomed other French and other nationalities that were coming to worship freely. Again, the initial driver of this for Calvin was freedom to worship God. Freedom to worship God. That was the driver. And where can we find that if we're being persecuted by the church, the Roman church in France? For the Scots who came to Geneva, they were for a time being persecuted by Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Roman Catholic. They had to flee for a time. That's how John Knox got to Geneva, met Calvin, was influenced, went back to Scotland. And so many of us with Scottish heritage are coming from that community here in the United States. So it's an interesting effect of having that historical link that influences how we act today together in community and our welcome of the refugee and thinking of what that would be like to be a refugee. I never had that experience. I lived in France for over 10 years though, and I met my husband there, and I was very aware of not having the right to vote. I really did feel outside of the community. And when we came back to the United States, I voted at every election, school board, municipal vote. I didn't miss one because I really did miss that community sense of having a voice. And my husband, who was French, came over with a green card. And for a long time, well, we got your green card, so we don't have to worry about anything. And we didn't worry about anything until my friend Roby was arrested. And then I said, Andre, is there an expiration on your green card? Because we had not really rushed into getting citizenship for him. It was there to be had, but we were in no hurry. So we got down to the courthouse pretty fast after that. He did his United States test on civics and passed 100%, and then was sworn in the courthouse that February. I remember it must have been 2018. But it was a big day. And frankly, we were in no hurry. I can really understand how one who had come into the United States and was given a temporary visa might think it was forever. That you forget once you get into your rhythm of life, gosh. So my husband is a US citizen, and as our two daughters, who are both born in Paris, but I immediately I lost no time with them. We got them to the US Embassy in Paris when they're 6 weeks old, held them up for a photo, swore them in. So they've been US citizens their whole lives, but I didn't want to miss a beat on that one. So they're dual citizens, in fact, today. So there's a lot to be thinking about, your own experiences with refugees. Maybe you've lived abroad, maybe you had these feelings of being unprotected when you're not in your own home, your US neighborhood. But we'll look also a little bit at influences of Augustine and the sense of the city of God and the secular city. And we'll look at that in the second hour about how we relate those two, trying to, make true this, the Lord's Prayer reference to your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's our striving always to create this kingdom come. And we'll talk too about the near neighbor. Who do we privilege in our loving the neighbor? Someone close, someone far. How do we help everyone? And that's often not possible to be there for everyone. But I do want to have us think about that, and as we come together again after our breakout group session, which we'll do in just a moment. And then just a reference, if I had mentioned earlier, this comparing our Reformed faith tradition, also thinking about the Roman Catholic tradition. It's called the Catholic social teaching. It's a preference for the poor is often what's described as, but it's really just a flat out, if someone is in need, we help them. There's none of this sense of discernment on other aspects. It's just you help the poor. It's charitable giving, and that is the emphasis that sometimes can be very impractical when I think about it. Just giving, for me, it would be like, well, you've given away all your wealth to help the poor, and then what do you do when you have nothing left? That's always where I think, can I be more prudential in being able to help as many as I can, but reserving some kind of capital. But that's the place I'm coming from. My own concept of life together in community is trying to have enough for everyone. But the Catholic social teaching might say, no, give it all away. My church in Chatham Township in New Jersey, we have a big hill where the church is on top of the hill, the big front lawn. Every October we put pumpkins out and we sell them. We get the pumpkins from indigenous people out in Arizona. They send them to us. We buy them directly from them at cost, and then we inflate the price. We sell these really expensive pumpkins on our front lawn, and the profits, if you could call them profits, we take and give to the food bank of New Jersey. So along the way, we're trying to help as many people as we can. And next to our big church with our big front lawn and the pumpkins is the Roman Catholic Church called Corpus Christi of Chatham, right next door. And they also have big front lawn, but not as high a hill because we got there first. We got the big hill. So Presbyterian, but at the time there weren't as many Roman Catholics. Now there are more Roman Catholics in the area. So the priest next door and we talk all the time and share in an interfaith clergy group. And he was telling me as I moved in, I've only been there a couple of years. He said, yeah, there's this bank account, and we have monies together. All our churches used to pay dues in and give money away to people that were in need. But we stopped doing that for I don't know, several years ago, because we were getting scammed by people. We felt like people were not being honest with us. So we just have this bank account. And he was so frustrated. He said, we should have just given it all away. And I thought, well, yeah, we probably should. And we've been giving all of the money that's in that bank account to the local food bank that we started during COVID, because so many more people were coming in hungry and needing food that we weren't even aware of in what is a fairly affluent community in New Jersey. So that food bank never closed. And we've been funding it with our dollars that had been treasured, probably by the Presbyterians, now being spent with the advice of our Catholic neighbors. So I'm grateful for that. So I wanted to take a time now to do our small group sessions. So hopefully that was fruitful for all of you to be, finding a common conversation around these three questions. We had one group that was looking at the Afghani refugees, specifically having a Muslim family moving into town and how to welcome the non-Christian. Then group two was looking at who to welcome when you have a Ukrainian refugee family. And here there were some interesting aspects to this in our own life in the news cycle, with the tendency for these people to be coming in more that they are a Christian community, the either Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox, that the Ukraine refugees have been sharing together. And how do we welcome a non-Presbyterian Christian in, and other issues around that. And then the third group, we're looking at how do we invite in people like the Indonesian refugees that I worked with a few years ago. They were long-term resident aliens. They were Presbyterian, more conservative, but they were with us. And then those issues around being, falling out of the legal system, and how do we welcome? So I wondered if I could invite a speaker from each group to just come up and share your general findings with the audience now. And we could start with group one. We had Roland was our leader, but I know that it's interesting too, because I understood that this congregation at Darnestown Presbyterian has welcomed in an Afghani family. So maybe Neil, you could speak to us about that experience. Thank you.
Just basically, I guess the way that it happened was because of our relationships in the community. We have a partnership with a group in Germantown called Germantown Global Connection, that is a community sponsored by our presbytery that looks at that primarily is trying to reach out to non-affiliated people who have either never been affiliated with a church or who have been affiliated with a church and have fallen away. And so Norm Gordon is the pastor who is leading that congregation, and his primarily way of reaching those folks is inviting them into service to the community rather than starting with worship. And so in doing that, then he found out, well, there are these Afghan refugees who've come here and are living in this hotel and need rides to their to visit the office to get their paperwork done, to go to doctor's appointments, to go to mosque, everything. So he called me up and said, would you give Hami a ride? I can't do it today. And I said, sure. I went and I met this guy who was an interpreter for the U.S. Army. And he and his wife and young daughter, she was maybe 7 months old when they came over, just escaped in those harrowing scenes that you saw on television. They escaped over here. I thought he had one of those SIVs, the special immigration visas. He couldn't get one. He qualified in every way except for one, and that was that he wasn't one of the top 50 that year to apply. And there are only 50 per year that are given out of SIVs, total Afghan and Iraqi, only 50 per year. And so, so we developed this relationship with Hami. They've got him and his family a temporary apartment in Silver Spring, and he and his family are there. People pulled together, helped furnish the apartment in partnership with ECDC, which is a non-religious affiliated group that settles refugees. They are this resettlement organization, and we just partnered with them and got them, through the generosity of people in this congregation, a car and everything they needed for their apartment. And I've continued to be in conversation with Hami, and I know some other folks have too, and furniture and things like that. Hami now has his work permit all together, and he's got a full-time job. It was difficult at first because he was expected to work, but didn't have all the paperwork he needed. And just kind of accompanying him through that. One of the things that Hami has told me is how surprised he is that Christians would help Muslims like this. That was, he had grown up in an all Muslim culture and expected to be rejected by Christians and by a Christian culture. And he is just very grateful for the welcome that he's received. So at any rate, I wanted to share that with you and say that's kind of where we are in welcoming an Afghan family.
Thank you, Roland. Roland was adding, he was off screen, but that there are several congregations throughout the area and in other states that have been assisting these Afghani families, which is a wonderful sign of welcome. And the sense of urgency is an interesting conversation to have as we, as you continue your talks at home about war refugees. Is there something special there that strikes a chord? And now to ask for our second group, if Nancy Fox could come forward to share with us this group 2 topic about whom do we welcome if it's a Ukrainian family.
Thanks. So let me just say my voice shakes. That's just part of the deal. So we had a wonderful group with lots of experience in welcoming refugee families, but none of us have yet welcomed a Ukrainian family. For us, there was no issue. The immediate thought was, well, we connect them in with the Ukrainian Catholic Church, if that's what they are. And then we got into this really rich discussion about, well, we as Americans are problem solvers, and we get a family come and they are a problem for us to solve and fix and make all their decisions for them. And how important it is to instead come with the questions, give them the options. These things are available. You would be welcome to come to our church. You could get a ride, or we could help you find transportation, or some of us initially accompany you to the Ukrainian church and you could check that out. Or maybe you want to rest on Sundays. What would you like to do? And so, group, let me put it back to you. What else did we talk about that you found rich? So, yeah.
In general, I think it was the real need to be culturally aware, and part of that is to realize that we're not aware, that our presuppositions are not necessarily the same presuppositions. And then finally, at the end, and that some people we found, if they disagreed with a decision that one of the refugee families made, say not to work as hard as they might, they thought, well, they're lazy, they're not trying very hard, and there's a loss of interest. Finally, at the very end, we said, well, with a Ukrainian family, that would be very different than the Syrian family or the Afghan family that we've experienced welcome with, because we assumed that the Ukrainian family would not be necessarily staying here long-term, but would be eager to go home. And that would be a whole different kind of project. And so that might or might not be something that we were geared up to do, willing to do, felt called to do.
Yeah. Is that it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is an interesting aspect to the Ukrainian refugees. Some of them were not given permanent visas on well, there's an argument that it was purposeful, in that there was a sense that this war in Ukraine was temporary, that it would be resolved, and the refugees wanted to go home and do, but we don't know the duration. So we'll have to be sensitive to that as time goes on and these refugees continue to be here. Again, that 18-month limit on the SIV visa and other kinds of temporary visas, what will happen then? So David Roden, we would invite you to talk about the Indonesian refugees sample, a Presbyterian long-term resident.
Yes, we had a bunch of Darnestown people here who are doing something similar with the Brazilian congregation, sharing facilities and trying to do things together, and not really worrying about the theology issue, but so there's some of that. There was also an example, I think perhaps similar to this one, maybe it's the same, of a person in the congregation who went home to take care of some sick person and came back and got, in trouble, couldn't get back into the country because of their status, didn't know about that. I also brought up an experience at my church, Westminster in Alexandria, where we were hosting a Spanish Pentecostal church in our facility, and they became so large and so loud that we had to kick them out. But they became a very prominent, and successful church in themselves. But, we were a way that they could get started and grow and give them their own opportunity to become something special. So, thanks.
Well, that's very encouraging to see the spirit at work through your welcome to help others get launched and thrive. And that is our hope together. So thank you for the time you've taken on that first question. And we'll continue together now. I wanted to move on to the second part of our presentation. Yes. Oh, you have some questions from the live stream audience. Yes, Larry.
Just two quick questions. The first is, can you say more about the similarities and differences between refugee and asylum seeker?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Historically, the US, until quite recently, I think until 1980, you couldn't come here as a refugee if you weren't seeking asylum from communist presence. It was all about the communist threat. So if you were fleeing a communist country, you were a refugee. And that was astounding to me when I was learning that as I researched this book. So since then, the United States is aligned with other nations through the United Nations Convention that people who are fleeing for their lives can seek asylum in the United States. And if they seek asylum from the time they're in their own country, they apply to be a refugee. That's the legal concept. And then if they're granted that, they're given a refugee visa. I'm not sure if it's specifically stated as refugee or a green card, but it is access, and it lets them stay in the United States as a refugee permanently. And that is the refugee under legal definition. And we know that someone coming in that way has been vetted and that they've been vetted by United States government authorities. And then the asylum seeker is the one who's arrived in the United States without any specific permissions, but is seeking asylum and is making their claim at the border to be given permission to stay because they've been persecuted and in fear of their lives, and they can be given that status as asylee, but there's a court hearing that has to follow.
Great. Just one more from Diana online. Can you say more about TPS, temporary protective status?
Temporary protective status, I don't have a lot more to add, except that it is this, like the SIV, a situation where you're able to be in the US for a period of time, and that you could lose your status with the duration of time, so that you would need to be in compliance or at least aware of your status in terms of the month to month, how long can you stay? And then once you're here, what can you be applying for the longer term? And that's where it would be important and could be a help from churches to direct these people with temporary visas to get legal counsel, to get advice on next steps, what they can be doing while they're in the US. So I don't have a lot of specifics on that, but I'm hopeful that that's something that we could get more input from groups like the Just Neighbors or others that are specialists in the area. But there's a lot of effort now to help people get to safety, and then help them to either stay long-term or be ready to return to their home countries if it's safe for them to go. One of the frustrations for people like my congregant, Roby, who had outstayed his visa, the only corrective for him was to leave the United States for 10 years, and then he'd be allowed to reapply seeking refuge. And that's just so futile, because going back to the country that it was dangerous for you is really not a solution. So that was the quandary he found himself in, and I think we'll see more problems like that. All right, thank you for your participation in the different groups. And we'll spend a little bit of time now looking at our general community approaches and the Reformed faith history of the refugee. as something that I think through these recent months of experience with war-torn areas in our world and the history with Calvin, we're becoming more aware of being a refugee, fleeing for one's life, trying to find a safe place where you can live, establish, worship, and thrive. So I wanted to spend some time looking at Calvin's life and his influence on the city of Geneva in particular, and how he ended up getting there. And it's always interesting to me because he spent some time studying law, as I did, and working in that other area, but always had a passion for the theological. So thinking about his life, just a reminder, if you haven't brushed up on your Calvin history in a while, he was born in France, John Calvin Jean Cauvin. He grew up in a town about 35 miles northeast of Paris, in a town called Noyon. And his father had a role in the local Roman Catholic administration. I think he was an administrator, and he was able to get a kind of tuition paid for Roman Catholic schooling, almost like preparation for priesthood for his son, Jean. The mother of John Calvin had died when he was like 5 or 6. So I think there was an interest in having solid education and also the church family for his upbringing. He did have a sister Marie, a brother Antoine, is all I know of, but there was this influence of his father being part of the church, but also as an administrator saw there were some issues at this time of Reformation. So Calvin was born about 27, 30 years after Luther. And he was sort of almost a second generation reformist, and very much influenced by Luther's work out of Germany and the reform element of seeking to be saved through grace alone, and looking at the scriptural authority as guidance rather than the church in determining one's salvation. This was, very reassuring for Calvin and others who were reading about this idea of God's graciousness being enough to find one's forgiveness and salvation and ability to thrive without this overlay of a church hierarchy, and one that had become quite corrupt. So that was the influence at the time. And also there was a reform element already happening in France. They were called the evangelicals, this influence from the Luther's writings and teachings. And of course, with Luther getting things written and down in the vernacular, being able to communicate with more people about his reforms, did have an influence on others. Now, initially, Luther was just really trying to change the theology structure, but not so much the liturgy of worship. He was okay with the way church service looked and felt, but it was the background ideas of how we find God's grace and forgiveness and mercy. So these were the changes that Calvin was picking up on. So when he got through his education in Noyon as a young boy, and then his father sent him to the Sorbonne, and he spent some time in like a high school level doing humanist studies. And the King of France, Francois Premier, who was Francis I, was very much interested in humanism. So kind of like a liberal art, studying Greek and Latin and reasoning. And this was really catching on throughout Europe. And the king was okay with all of those studies. And Calvin was interested in that as well. So he was studying some of that. And then his father, I think with some of the tensions happening in the Roman Catholic Church, his father said, "You've got to go to law school now. You're going to move from religious studies to the law," which is very much what happened to me. So I can totally relate this. I majored in religious studies, and I ended up going to law school on advice of my father, who said, you got to earn a living. So I did that for several years. Not bad advice, certainly influential. And I think it helped Calvin as well, because when he ended up in Geneva, he he used that legal training also, not only for how he organized the church, but also the town. So it's interesting to look at. So I got into the Sorbonne, he's about 18 years old. He's good friends with Nicholas Kopp, who was at grade school with him, and they were fast friends, and they were talking together about all these reform ideas. And apparently Nicholas Kopp was a professor of medicine by that time. So as Calvin was studying law, Nicholas Kopp, who must have been a few years older, was elected rector of the Sorbonne, and he gave a speech to the community, the Sorbonne community. It was on All Saints Day, November 1st, 1533, maybe. He was using in it many humanist ideas, but also he spoke on the Sermon on the Mount, and he was talking about how God's grace is available even to those who are persecuted, sort of giving a hint to the evangelicals, as they were called, or the French Huguenot, the Reform, the people influenced by the Reform in France. And the kind of the papal police got wind of it, and the king, Francis I, said, we must stop him. He must be one of those Lutherans. And in France, there was a concern because the French king had a kind of a deal with the papacy, and he saw his own kingship as being divinely anointed. And so for him, he wanted to have a Roman Catholic nation. They called it une foi, une foi, une loi. That's one king, one law, one faith. And that was France. And so it was just really for them, for the king to keep his legitimacy, he wanted to keep it in this way, a Roman Catholic nation. And so anything that started to look Reform or Lutheran was a problem. So they went out to arrest Nicholas Kopp, and they thought that Calvin had helped him write the speech because they were such fast friends. So they took off on horseback in the middle of the night. Kopp he got all the way to Basel in Switzerland and escaped. And Calvin went to Angoulême, which is in eastern France, and stayed with a friend and thought he was safe there. He hadn't done anything directly wrong, but he was definitely being snooped out, and he realized he was in trouble. So by then he's like 26. He's 25, 26 years old. And at this friend's house in Angoulême, he starts writing the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is his first draft of what would become, the magnum opus that we study even to this day in seminary about our Reformed faith tradition. It started out as a catechism of what we believe about God, our relationship with God theologically, and a catechism about, in the same tradition that Luther had written. He was very much influenced by him. In future iterations of this great work, it would become more of a work on training ministers to be Reformed faith ministers. And so he reorganized it over the years, and over more than a decade of writing it, ended up 1,500 pages long, and it organized around the Apostles' Creed idea of God, Christ, Spirit, and then a long section on the church, the workings of the church. So that was happening. He's 25 years old. And I wanted to share with you this map. I don't know if online you can share that, Yvonne. I wasn't able to get a print out of it, so I'll do a quick drawing of the map of Europe. If you're not sure what I'm drawing, it's meant to be Europe, starting with France. So we've done the general hexagon shape of France is always helpful. And but over here in this area, this is where we've got Swiss territory, and Calvin wanted to get to Strasbourg, which is up here, and he wanted to be a scholar and just study and write. I don't know if you can see that. And Paris is in the center. It's France, and this is Paris. And so he was heading up here, and during different parts of different wars, this section here has been part of France, has been part of Germany, and at the time it was an imperial free city. It was not in France. The French kingdom ended here in the 1530s. Down here was this Principate, or kind of a principality of the House of Savoy. This is essentially where Italy is. It's kind of before Italy became one nation. So you have the Italian influence in Rome below. But this kind of House of Savoy was trying to, had essentially rulership over Geneva, which I'm going to put here, and hopefully that shows up on the map online. So here's Geneva, where Calvin ends up. Then you have Bern, which was Protestant. So the Swiss area was already very much reformed and influenced and free, but there were, like Freiburg, I think it was here. This was very Roman Catholic still. Bern was Protestant. Geneva was teetering between, it wasn't quite one way or the other. It was essentially Roman Catholic until Calvin arrives in 1535. And so what the interesting story was that here, Strasbourg, is where he wanted to go to study. And I guess he got, he got to the fork in the road, and there were the local police, sort of the ICE agents of the day, that were looking for him, and he had to diverge and go to Geneva instead of to Strasbourg, where he wanted to be with his family. And well, it was at the time he was with a brother and sister. He first was able to go to Geneva alone, came back when there was a brief time of amnesty, sorted out family affairs, and then ended up back in Geneva. And he was still hoping to go to Strasbourg from there, but there was a reformer in Geneva who was trying to bring the Protestant Reformed tradition into the city, Nicholas Farel, and someone else somehow recognized Calvin in the crowd and encouraged him to stay and said, he must stay. It's a godsend that you're here. Already he developed this reputation. He was 26 years old. And he was asked to stay, and with Farel to create this Reformed church. They were able to influence the town council to have Protestantism, to this Reformed tradition, be the religion of the community. And Bern helped with that kind of militarily, using their influence to push away the House of Savoy prince, kept them away from the influences of the Roman Catholic Freiburg group that was trying also to win over Geneva, and Bern made it clear this was going to be Protestant. And then the Genevan community also had to push back Bern a little bit and say, well, we're going to be independent of you. And that took some doing, but they succeeded. So Geneva, by this time, the late 1530s, is starting out as a Reformed faith community, and is in itself politically almost like a revolution of sorts of redefining how they would operate. And that's where this is where Calvin lands at a really excellent time for him to be able to influence both the secular town and the religious life, because that's where he really left his lasting gifts to us, I suppose, not only organizing the church polity in terms of having a very democratically elected, the governance by elders, to have a sense of calling that was on equal footing with ministers, to identify that there would be doctors of theology that would preach and teach, and then the ministers themselves that would be pastoral care, preaching and caring of a congregation, and then the deacon and the elder as lay leaders. So I found this really interesting. I wanted to share with you a quote from a book by Carter Lindbergh on the European Reformations, which I recommend to you. It's a great read, and there were just a couple descriptions of Geneva I wanted to share with you. One was from John Knox, who writes, "Geneva is the most perfect school of Christ that ever was in this earth since the day of the apostles. In other places, I confess Christ to be truly preached, but manners and religion to be so sincerely reformed I have not seen in any other place." So this is John Knox, who was himself a refugee in Geneva while Mary Tudor was had taken over the Scottish lands with the rest of Britain for that period of time. And he would return to Scotland when she was overthrown. And then others stating the extravagant praise of Geneva, this holy city guarded by legions of angels, describing it as the new Rome of the Reformation, not only a refuge for Protestants expelled from other lands for their faith, but also as a Mecca for adherents to the new faith, the Reformed faith. So this was a very interesting time, a model of Christian commonwealth, but it took a long time to develop. It wasn't overnight. Another comment about Calvin, as he was looked at as a student, this was when he was learning his humanist arts back in Paris. He said that in 1528, at age 18, Calvin received his Master of Arts degree in his mastery of and skill in the prevalent forms of Latin argumentation. And he wrote his institutes in Latin, the whole thing in Latin. His friends said that he was so good at this and worked in his Latin argumentation with religious and ethical seriousness that it may be for this reason his classmates nicknamed him the accusative case, which is saying a lot about Calvin. But other more humane descriptions from his student days from his friend and biographer Theodore Beza, who explained Calvin's penchant for lying in bed in the mornings as a time for reflecting on diligent late night studies. So it is just a fun, we don't see too much about the life of Calvin in his writings. He wasn't much to devote himself to reflection, personal reflection, the way Luther shared quite a bit, as did others. But Calvin was more restrained. But interesting, he did renounce all of his Roman Catholic upbringing. He returned to his hometown in Noyon during this brief amnesty period in 1534. He went back to his hometown and returned what are described as ecclesiastical benefices, which I wonder if we're like, I don't know, a badge or something that he had showing him to be a true man of the faith. He returned them and really renounced his connection to the church. And then another understanding that he had not been officially ordained as a pastor, but was self-taught as a theologian. As you may know, he became a preacher and pastor, not by ordination, but by action of the Geneva Town Council. So all of that is just interesting. This person who had really reflected on a way of sharing the faith and a new theological construct, and he kept to that and was able to stay. He really didn't want to be in Geneva, but Nicholas Farrell, this became friend, but someone who recognized him as having great potential for leading the community there, said, "You must stay. It's God's will." I think I have a quote on that. He said, Calvin arrived in Geneva in 1536. He planned to only stay overnight before continuing on to Strasbourg, but was recognized. And then Farrell said, "You are a godsend to us. You must stay." But Calvin refused, explaining that he was a scholar, not an administrator or a preacher, and that he lacked the temperament for such a task because he generally did not get along well with people. But Farrell continued on and said, "You must stay," and denounced him as being selfish and saying that God would curse his scholarly life if he didn't stay. So Calvin stayed. He felt like he must, therefore. But there would be a time later, the two of them, Farrell and Calvin, tried to organize the church to be really running the town in a way that was so unusual that not even the townsmen could accept it. They threw them out, and they did end up going to Strasbourg for 3 years. Calvin was in Strasbourg doing what he had wanted to do, and he was really happy during those years, and eventually was called back because of the way things were not going as planned in Geneva. They needed his help, and he came back again at age 27 this time in Geneva to continue the work that he had begun. So I just wanted to share with you those highlights of his time there. Apparently Strasbourg was another wonderful city for the reformers to spend time in. It sounded like a really great place for theological thinking. A lot of the reformers were passing through there, Martin Bucer, and also others who were formerly priests but accepted Reformation and then married, a man named Zell, and his wife Catherine had extraordinary kind of dinner parties with theologians, and Calvin was there, and it sounded like it's a very interesting time for theological thought. And so he enjoyed that for about 3 years, and then he came back to Geneva and would spend the rest of his life there doing this Reformation work of religion and of the town. So it's there where I wanted to take us, and looking at the church as moral exemplar, where there are times when there's such injustice in our lives that we want to look to ways of lifting up an alternative way of being. And so I think Calvin did that in his Reformed time, with the Reformed faith in Geneva, really founding a whole new way of being church together. And then we see echoes of that later, especially in World War II Germany with Karl Barth and his work, which was coming into a time when there was the confessing church in Germany. There were others that were so under the thumb of the Nazi party that they were forced to accept this idea of Hitler being at the head of the church. And Barth came in with some other of the German priests and the Lutheran priests who were courageous enough to say, no, that we don't accept this. And they drafted together, and probably Barth was the main pen behind it. And he was Swiss, theologian reformer, but he was teaching in Germany at the time to say, no, only Christ is the head of our church. And this resulted in that theological declaration of Barman, and one that you can share in your affirmations of faith on a Sunday morning. You may see references to it when we want to be reminded that it's Christ who is the head of our church, and no political potentate can take that away. And there are times when that has to be said again and again. So we saw that with Calvin and other reformers saying, Christ the head of our church, not the Pope. Here, Germany, World War II, it's Christ the head of our church, not dictator, not a Hitler. So that continues to be something where we're called upon to break with what is imposed on us as a secular law situation. So to take this to our own personal context, and when we're looking at the refugee and the immigrant, people who have fallen out of legal status here, at what point do we stand up as church and say, the law is either unclear or unjust or so confusing or so unmerciful? This person that didn't have that final aspect to his application was, like number 51 looking for an SIV visa, or just was here legally, but then fell out of the system. Can we find some mercy? Can we show welcome as a church? So that is something that I think we take away from these reformers over time, and examples of history that can help us to live our lives as Christians and to be welcoming. So I wanted to offer you those background pieces, and also to consider, for our own church lives together, ways that we can be welcoming in our witness. And there are several different aspects to it. We've seen more recently in South Africa with the Belhar Confession, where there's a refusal to accept apartheid or separation of people by race, that we're all together one in Christ. Looking at other aspects of what we can do in our lives here in the US, a lot of discussion about whether, this was especially true 5 or 6 years ago when I wrote this book, should our church become a sanctuary church? Is that helpful, and what does that mean? At a time, I've been more hesitant about it as a resident of New Jersey, where our climate is temperate, and I've talked to people who've been in sanctuary living in a church, and should our church be home for refugees who are fleeing authorities? And it really depends on your context. I haven't found it to be helpful to the individual to stay long-term inside a church in my community. But there was a time when this started in Arizona, in the desert and the border of Mexico, where people were dying as they were trying to flee from persecution in Central America. And they were coming north, and they were dying in the desert because of the extreme heat and conditions. So that was a time when sanctuary church was really developed. And I wanted to just raise that. I discuss it in my book as a time when Presbyterian pastor John Fife, who had a congregation there, a small church in Arizona, was receiving people to finding them dying in the desert and trying to help them to survive, brought them to his church. At first followed all the rules, would pay bail for them if they were arrested, tried to help them get asylum, but they would constantly be finding them to be rearrested once they paid their bail and got them out of the temporary incarceration situation. So they started to work more in ways of civil disobedience. And yet they too found, civil disobedience was something that can be off-putting to Presbyterians. We want to follow the law. So they started to describe the people that were coming in as legal refugees rather than illegal aliens. Well, they were legal refugees, not actually accurate, because we know to be a refugee, you have to have applied and been given that status before you arrive. But it wouldn't have been wrong for these people to seek asylum if that's what they were looking to do. So, and also they were, instead of calling civil disobedience, they renamed it a civil initiative, and that encouraged more church people to take part. But this was back in the 80s, and it was really early days. And I'd heard a speech that John Fife gave at the time in Princeton Seminary, a recording I listened to, and he was really acting in the spirit of God to save people's lives. And he really saw that there was genocide going on, and it was important to offer sanctuary in his church there on the border. And he did. And there was a court case, people were arrested, including him, and he was not convicted, but several people were. And it was a time of learning about this situation of immigration and how we can help our neighbor when it just seems unjust not to. So there's that. I've also spoken to a pastor who was up in Buffalo who their congregation declared their church to be sanctuary for those who were trying to come into the US from the north border. Just again, they had freezing cold temperatures that they were faced with, and they wanted to help people on their way in and out. But I'm hoping that we can find other ways that are more permanent and more helpful to the individual who's looking to settle here, that they could really thrive, find work, find residence, and find some legal protection for their stay. So that's something we can be talking about as a secondary conversation group. But I wanted to offer us a time to talk about aiding the legal refugee who arrives on your doorstep today, maybe unannounced, like the people who were sent to Martha's Vineyard. And we don't have that much time left, but I had mentioned earlier the group in Martha's Vineyard, and I can bring out to you now the second conversation question that we could talk about maybe as one group. It's just one question. It says, since April, thousands of migrants, most of them Venezuelans, have been coaxed onto buses and planes heading to Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, and even last week, Martha's Vineyard, after enduring a perilous journey overland from their broken country to make a fresh start in the United States. And the transportation to the Democratic strongholds had been organized by Texas and Florida and Arizona, where those governors were trying to draw attention to a record surge in the number of people that were crossing into their borders. And they blame the Biden administration immigration policies. But effectively, they're saying, the argument we heard earlier, that can we keep peace if we allow all these people in? Will our community be stable? And these governors were saying it's not stable anymore if we let all of these people in here, so we want to send them to other states. So last week, 2 busloads of migrants were sent to the residence of Vice President Kamala Harris. This was probably now 3 or 4 weeks ago. And then more over the weekend. And then there were 2 planes flown into Martha's Vineyard. Democrats have called the stunts cruel, and many migrants have been left at least temporarily homeless at their new host cities, and most face an uphill battle to win their asylum cases. It will be years before the legal process is complete. So in the meantime, they're both straining the resources of cities, trying to provide them social services and filling a gap, but also filling a gap in the nation's labor market. While as many as 8 million immigrants are working in the United States without authorization, asylum applicants eventually receive employment permits while their cases are pending. And I later read an article by a man who was an immigrant, was shipped to Washington, D.C., and he was giving gratitude for that unexpected departure because he found work and was able to save up to help his family back home, which is what he had set out to do. So the question for us was, how do we welcome the unannounced visitor today, assuming that the person has a legal right to stay, but no shelter, work, or food? Consider these recent cases. How do we welcome the unexpected arrival of asylum seekers in our towns? What can churches do, and what would your church do to take action if a busload of refugees arrived in your town? So are you equipped, and what do you think you would do? And I'll just invite, conversation now from the floor if people have reactions, or maybe what you've already done. You're also close to Washington, D.C. Maybe you've experienced this already. Any thoughts? Oh, we'll get the mic. Where did that end up? Oh, yeah, the camera's back there.
At least two, you really do have to hold it close. At least two of our Presbyterian churches have been working with the Venezuelans bust in North Avenue, and I'm blanking on the name of the other one. But this is going on in our Presbyterian with churches providing meals, people to be there to help welcome. And so,
yeah, good. So you're experiencing it already, and the Presbyterian welcome has been to provide help for those creature comforts. And I think that would be an immediate need. Now, people need to be warm and fed and sheltered for the night. How we do that. Another comment here.
Right. Not sure the situation either in New Jersey or here in Maryland, but in Virginia, we took great opportunities with previously Lutheran social services. They seem to be more organized than we are on this basis. Now, they went away during the previous administration due to issues that we all know about, but they're now back as LIRS, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. So they have a way of dealing with these things that I think is somewhat more advanced than the Presbyterians. And just to commend that process that certainly worked for Emmanuel Presbyterian.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The Lutheran Church, as we were saying before, like Luther changed theology, but not so much liturgy or organization. So they still have a very vertical governance system. And maybe 5 years ago, the entire Lutheran denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is in our communion, ELCA, declared that every Lutheran church was to be a sanctuary church. Now, we as Presbyterians, I would never fly because we all have to vote on it. Every single one of us, church is our session. We would decide and what's right for us, and which is good. It's that at least allows us to consider our context. But ELCA, like, that's it. You are a sanctuary church, so no discussion. So that may be why they were more organized, that they have made a commitment to this message, mission to welcome the refugee. And that what does that look like to be a sanctuary church? Because frankly, it's not practical to have people sleeping in your church when you don't have safe, showers or just a safe place to sleep, or if you have, other users of the church space. So it's complicated, but it sounds like they found other ways to welcome. Any other comments or questions from the online group about the kind of test case that's it's really happening in our world right now with people coming in? And if not, I can just close with inviting you to continue the good work you're doing here with welcoming your refugee neighbors. It sounds like you've already got things underway, the Afghani families and others who are in your community, that you've made a decision to practice our scriptural encouragement in Matthew 25 to welcome the stranger in your midst and to provide for them. And I think that's a good first step. More things that we could be doing is legislative advocacy, to write to our congresspeople and senators to encourage changes to immigration law where that can be helpful to make it easier for people to stay once they've been allowed in, so that these temporary visas might be extended automatically rather than falling away automatically. There are other ways of, allowing people to remain in the US, and also just to assist them to get driver's licenses. Even if you're not with a valid visa, can you at least be given permission to have driver's license, employment, permission to work here, and that goes state by state. So you'll have to look to see what your state jurisdiction allows now, but that's something you could do some legislative advocacy through church to help your neighbor. So that I think would be something that could be welcomed. Also working with legal aid or other lawyer groups, or creating a lawyer group if you have a lot of lawyers in your community. That would be maybe a resource center for immigrants, or ways of proactively reaching out to help people with their asylum cases once they're here. There are some groups that I've worked with in New Jersey that are grassroots organizations to help people settle in that are refugees that have been given permission to stay. And often they found challenges because the incoming people have wanted to stay with their cultural friends group that might already be existing. So we're trying to get folks to live and to settle near us in Chatham area, which is in the western part of the state. But a lot of the immigrants have been closer to New York City and Jersey City, and they want to settle there. And so it's been hard to recognize, I think, as Group 2 is pointing out, we don't want to make decisions for people. And if there's this affinity group that's, that people should be allowed to live where they want to be. So we want to help without imposing ourselves too much. But there are these different resources that I think we can be part of or create ourselves, looking for ways to be a resource and an aid to our neighbors. So just to close, I wanted to let you know, if you haven't yet read my book, that the good news about Roby Sanger is that after his being incarcerated for 9 months, he was released the day before Thanksgiving, those 9 months after his arrest. And we were so grateful in our church because we had been praying for him. He was allowed out. He had to wear an ankle bracelet, which kept him monitored at all times. When he was returned with his family, he was able to recover his work. His children were safe and happy to have him home. After another few weeks, the ACLU worked, a legal organization, to also get a mercy hearing so that he could have the ankle bracelet removed and live more comfortably. And he was registered. He didn't try to flee, but he was back to where he began after a really difficult journey. And so it was a great sign of God's work in our lives, and a lot of rejoicing happening at that church. So it was a happy ending for him, but never a permanent solution. For him, he's still looking for a permanent visa here in the US. So if there are any other questions, be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll close here. Yes, sir. Oh, and we need the mic for you.
Trying to.
So this is
negotiate.
hard because you're asking me the question, but the audience is online, so
Exactly.
I should
Maybe I
probably
should
move, but
come
you can
closer
come
to
up
this.
here, or you can just talk to
Okay,
the
I'll come
camera.
up here. Okay, how about like this? Then I'm talking to you. and
Yeah, I can talk
talking
to both
them.
of us.
Mhm.
Yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
okay.
You have a
Oh, over
question.
here more. Hi. Hi, how you doing?
Oh, good to see you.
You know, when we read the media about the immigration system, and when I talked to my son's father-in-law who worked for ICE for 30-some years,
Mm,
his one sentence answer to the immigration system is, David, it's broken. Okay, I get it. And from what you've just described, it sure sounds you've described the brokenness of it.
mm,
And you've asked us to try to address it from an advocacy standpoint. And I do a lot of that in other areas.
Mm.
So how do we fix that which is broken? What do
Yeah.
you think? You've got a lawyerly background. I certainly don't.
Mm.
How could we fix this crazy quilt thing that you described at the outset?
Yeah.
What would you recommend? What should we get behind when we talk to our senators and members of Congress? What would you suggest for us?
Well, I think having more avenues of access to citizenship would be extremely helpful. So you come in on a temporary visa, but you could very quickly apply for US citizenship. That instead of having to wait 5 years or to not fall out of the system, that you could apply quickly. You could, show, good intent, seeking for work, establishing a home in there, churches could help with it. But to have that avenue to citizenship would be my number one choice. And then maybe number two, to have some kind of forgiveness in the system so that if you fell out of your visa, you overstayed, you didn't comply with something, that you could get back in the system and be given some kind of clemency, like a second chance. Well, this person, he overstayed his visa, but we're going to give him a new kind of visa. And if he continues to pay his taxes and stay clear of any criminal activity, he can stay, she can stay for as long as need be, and can apply for citizenship. But so much is the frustration of having no way forward that I think that would be important to be able to have those avenues to become a citizen. And then we could learn from immigration court lawyers and judges, asking them what else would be a quick and easy fix to help people in the short term as they come in, like the SIV visa. Couldn't that be extended indefinitely every 24-month periods, once especially as we see what's happening with the Ukraine war, and we just we know we need more time. We could do those things. But I think it's the lack of a way to become a citizen is the harder one, and the way that you can lose those rights quickly. So
There's
if
one
there are no
person
more
online.
questions, I think we
Someone
can
online would like to
close.
ask a question.
Oh, there's an online question. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you know what the Office of Public Witness is doing? The PCUSA office?
Yes. Well, I don't know. They're in DC. There's another one in New York City that is related, but not exactly the same work. The New York one is working with the UN and kind of witnessing to the UN developments. And then the one in DC, I would look to, this group here, your National Capital Group, to inform us more. Maybe there is a connection there. I know they do, offer commentary, prayers, lifting up issues, but I don't know of specifics right now. And they might offer guidance. Maybe that's a good next step for us to write to them and see how we might partner together to make progress. I think the denomination's stated clerk was there before becoming our stated clerk, so I bet he'd have some good inroads at giving us guidance for the next steps. But thank you all for your warm welcome this morning. I'm so glad we could be together, and I appreciate your time, and have a wonderful rest of your Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you.